There's much to talk about, but I have to zero in on two topics in particular because they're both so critical in demonstrating the mess we find ourselves in here in Minnesota. First, we'll catch up with Minnesota State Senator Nicole Mitchell, whose felony trial finally began after over a year of delays, which each seemed politically motivated. Then we'll break down a commentary by Dustin Grady of the radical socialist record of Minnesota State Senator Omar Fateh, who is widely regarded as the frontrunner to become the next mayor of Minneapolis. Welcome to Closing Argument.
4, 3, 2. Closing Argument with Walter Hudson.
If you're not from Minnesota, you could be forgiven for assuming that breaking into someone's house dressed all in black with burglary tools in your possession would mark the abrupt end of anyone's political career. Surely, an elected official who gets caught red-handed burglarizing a home is going straight to jail.
This is outrageous. This kind of behavior is never tolerated in Boracua. They put you in jail right away. No trial, no nothing. You're stealing, right to jail.
And being immediately removed from office. But that's not what happened to Minnesota State Senator Nicole Mitchell, despite being caught in the act of burglarizing her own stepmother, dressed like a cartoon version of a burglar, complete with a black skull cap and burglary tools. Senator Mitchell has managed to evade justice for over a year. Despite the excuses offered by Minnesota Senate Democrats, the real reason why a senator facing felony charges after being caught in the act remains in office after that long is because they simply could not allow her to be held accountable. That's because the current composition of the Minnesota Senate is 34 Democrats in a one-member majority against 33 Republicans. And Democrats in this state are so incredibly arrogant that they believe they can get away with retaining an alleged felon in their ranks with no electoral consequences. The incident itself occurred late in the 2024 legislative session with mere days left to complete work under a Democrat trifecta. If Minnesota Democrats had any decency, they would have held Mitchell accountable, removed her from the legislature, and negotiated an end of session with a tied Senate. Had they done that, a special election could have been held during the interim, and they likely would have restored their majority in time for this year's legislative session. But because Democrats value power above all else, that was not the course they chose. Instead, they held a ridiculous ethics hearing in which Senate President Bobby Joe Champion played a low-rent version of Johnny Cochran, claiming in essence that if the basement window doesn't fit, you must acquit. The sham hearing was an embarrassment to the institution and a thinly veiled effort to cling to power, despite most of the legislative work having already been accomplished for the term. Champion's arguments in this hearing, as chair of the Ethics Committee, centered on the premise that the Senate could not appropriately remove Mitchell prior to her being convicted in a court of law. It was a twisted and bastardized application of the concept of being innocent until proven guilty. But as we all know, that standard only applies to a criminal trial. It has nothing to do with a legislative ethics hearing. We don't need to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to eject a member from the legislature. We only need to demonstrate that their conduct is unbecoming of the office that they hold. And in Mitchell's case, it was quite obvious that her conduct colored outside the bounds of appropriate behavior for a state legislator. Mitchell was caught in the act of burglarizing her stepmother's home, having traveled 200 miles from her home in Woodbury in the dark of night. Her cover story was that she was concerned about the health and well-being of her recently widowed stepmother and was only checking up on her. But I don't know anyone who makes unannounced visits to relatives dressed all in black with a skull cap and burglary tools, and instead of knocking on the door or ringing the doorbell, breaks into a basement window and proceeds to creep around the residence. And yet, the argument from Bobby Joe Champion was that we can't rush to judgment and she must have her day in court before the Senate can properly act to reject her. Well, that day has come. Mitchell is in court as of this moment, and part of the proceeding was the public release of the 911 call and the body cam footage from the officers who arrested her. Here's a compilation of that footage.
Burke County 911.
Somebody just broke into my house. They ran down into my basement.
What's your address?
Get on the ground. Hands behind your back.
There's some back to the 10 volt. 451.
Carol? Yeah? It's Nicole. It's Nicole?
Oh, come on.
I was just trying to get a couple of my dad's things because he wouldn't talk to me anymore.
She also stole documents. I don't know. She's my stepdaughter.
I didn't steal any documents. How did I steal documents? She's gonna do what she's gonna do.
Okay.
My dad died last year. She's paranoid. Well, now she's really paranoid. I have never done anything like this. You're gonna find it out. I'm a military commander, for God's sakes.
Okay.
She's got severe Alzheimer, and there were just a couple things in my dad's I wanted to come get. Because whenever he tried to help her right after the funeral,
Trying to help her. She's trying to get money.
and obviously I'm not good at this.
Now, no reasonable person looks at that and has any doubt whatsoever as to the guilt of Senator Mitchell. She was caught red-handed, and there's no reasonable alternative explanation for why she was there, dressed in all black, in possession of burglary tools, having broken into a basement window, and not announcing herself to her stepmother. This is an open and shut case. Mitchell will be going to prison. But again, the issue before the Senate is not to determine her criminal guilt, it's to determine whether her documented conduct is becoming of a Minnesota state senator. Now, you can hear her literally confess. She says, "I'm not very good at this, and I know I did something wrong," and worries verbally about her military pension. These are not the statements you would make if you believed that you were innocent. And yet, in spite of all these facts that were documented prior to the 2024 ethics hearing, you still had Minnesota Democrats circling the wagons to protect her from accountability. Now, we live in pretty cynical times where people have come to expect corruption, graft, and political favoritism. But I simply refuse to believe that Minnesotans have become so numb to their own inherent sense of justice that they will allow this obvious abuse of power to go without electoral consequence in 2026. Every single Democrat in the state of Minnesota needs to be held accountable for this. They all went along with it. They all sided with the decision to retain Mitchell, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of her wrongdoing. And they did it to retain a majority in one chamber for a handful of days at the end of the 2024 legislative session. Had they acted honorably and appropriately, the only thing they would have lost would have been total control of those final few days in the legislature. But God forbid they have to negotiate with Senate Republicans in a temporary tie for just a couple of weeks. That prospect was so abhorrent to them that they were willing to endure the eternal shame of standing by a credibly alleged felon, allow her to vote on public safety legislation, allow her to vote on motions to have her removed from the body, and to otherwise completely ignore her conflicts of interest. And it's an affront to both common decency and the dignity of the institution. By contrast, when Republican state senators reacted to the arrest of one of theirs for unspeakable acts targeted against minors, he was pushed to resign within hours. There wasn't a single Republican who attempted to make an excuse for him. And I firmly believe that would have been the case regardless of the impact on the balance of power in the legislature. If there had been an attempt to retain Justin Eichhorn, who was arrested for soliciting sex from a minor, I, for one, would have condemned it without hesitation. And I don't believe I would have been alone. But that's not how Democrats think. To them, power is the only priority. Decency and accountability don't factor into their thinking. And so now, here they are over a year later having to endure this public embarrassment. Had they acted promptly, they could have saved some face and portrayed themselves as champions of the institution rather than partisan hacks. But that opportunity is gone. Now they will forever wear the stain of having sided with a credibly alleged felon who will undoubtedly end up being a convicted felon. Also, they could retain a tenuous grasp on one chamber in the state legislature. Honestly, I can't fathom how anyone anywhere votes for a Democrat. I recently profiled the candidacy of Minnesota State Senator Omar Fateh for mayor of Minneapolis, comparing him to the openly socialist Zohran Mamdani, who's running for mayor of New York City. My friend Dustin Greggy, who you should be following on X at GreggyDustin, has put together a thread unpacking just how radical this guy is. Let's tick through it. Greggy starts off saying, Omar Fateh supported the failed campaign to defund and dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department, replacing it with a Department of Public Safety. When shown polling that white voters supported the amendment but black voters opposed it, Fateh called it a disinformation campaign. Fateh continues to advocate for the same policy that was already rejected by voters in one of the bluest cities in America during his run for mayor. This signals the unfettered arrogance of committed leftists. For all their talk about democracy, the hardcore political left will never abide by the will of the majority unless it affirms their own preconceived convictions. As a state legislator, I've seen this play out time and time again. In 2024, Minnesota Democrats changed the state flag without a vote from residents, instead relying upon a hand-picked panel of 13 radical leftist activists under the premise that it was more important for so-called underrepresented communities to have a say than everyone else in the state. This comment from Fateh about the polling of black residents in Minneapolis is also revealing. It aligns with my own experience talking to those very residents. When I talk to black community leaders in Minneapolis, I don't hear calls for defunding the police. I hear calls to work with the police, coordinating with community groups to de-escalate and reduce violence. But that's not enough. It's not radical enough for the likes of Fateh and the leftist white voters who support his policy. Black voters should take note. Greggy continues. Omar Fateh is running on a platform of Trump-proofing Minneapolis, which means refusing to allow any coordination with federal agents whatsoever. Fateh even showed up to a federal drug and human trafficking raid in Minneapolis to resist law enforcement. One woman was arrested for assaulting agents during the operation. That same investigation recovered 900 pounds of crystal meth. In his own op-ed on Medium, Fateh wrote the following in reference to this raid. Quote, "We cannot be a sanctuary city in name only. Mayor Fry says that he is prepared to stand up to Donald Trump and will protect our immigrant communities. His inaction last week on Tuesday, however, demonstrates his inability to effectively fight back against Donald Trump. He cannot be trusted to reform his Minneapolis Police Department, who we saw assist Trump's agents in creating fear, confusion, and distrust." Unquote. Now, this is quite literally criminal. Interfering with federal law enforcement is obstruction of justice. It's not legitimate political protest. Yet here's Fateh openly advocating for obstruction of justice as policy. And it's particularly noteworthy that his tune didn't change upon discovering that the impact of the ICE raid was taking 900 pounds of meth off the streets of Minneapolis. He apparently doesn't care about that. He'd apparently prefer to have those drugs on the street, ruining the lives of Minneapolis residents, rather than acknowledge the legitimacy of federal law enforcement. Now, it's astounding that the voters of Minneapolis apparently agree with that absurd position. Greggy's next point. Omar Fateh is no stranger to using his authority to push back against investigative agencies, especially when he frames it as racism. In this case, he claimed the Minnesota Department of Education was trying to shut down businesses based on suspicion rather than evidence. He was defending several organizations, including Feeding Our Future. That's the same group he went to bat for after receiving $11,000 in campaign donations from individuals later charged in the $250 million Feeding Our Future fraud scheme, which fell under Minnesota Department of Education oversight. Only after intense public scrutiny did Fateh quietly return the money. This is consistent with the leaked audio recording revealed earlier this year where current Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison was caught siding with Feeding Our Future fraudsters over the very state agencies he is tasked with representing in court. And it particularly resonates with today's news that a web of companies providing so-called housing support services billed taxpayers thousands of dollars while struggling families remained homeless. The priority of Democrats like Fateh and Ellison don't seem to be ensuring that people in need actually get assistance, but rather that their political constituency remains in business, as Ellison said in the leaked audio. Keep the money flowing to people who vote for and organize politically on behalf of Minnesota Democrats. That seems to be more important to these people than actually serving Minnesotans. Omar Fateh's controversies around campaign finance don't end there, though. His campaign volunteer, Muse Mohammed, was convicted of lying to a grand jury about illegally handling absentee ballots linked to ballot harvesting. Federal investigators later proved he did handle the ballots in question. Muse is also Fateh's brother-in-law. After Muse pleaded the fifth in front of the Minnesota State Ethics Committee, there was no way to tie Fateh's campaign with the ballot harvesting scheme. Fateh was also instructed to undergo training for failing to disclose payments he made for online campaign advertising from the same Ethics Committee hearing. That one kind of speaks for itself. Grakey continues. Omar Fateh has supported some of the most radical proposals as a state senator, including free or reduced health care for illegal immigrants. Here are two clips showing Fateh leading a vocal protest attempting to shut down a press conference at the Minnesota State Capitol after Democrats backed down on taxpayer-funded health care for illegal aliens.
You're killing our communities! 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 One Minnesota right! One Minnesota right! One Minnesota right! One Minnesota right! One Minnesota right!
Several legislators seen in the video have already endorsed Fateh in his campaign for mayor. This is noteworthy because these actions by Fateh and his fellow legislators are arguably criminal. It's a crime to disrupt the peace. More importantly, it's a felony to cause a disruption at the legislature. But these sorts of crimes are never charged or prosecuted because all of the authorities with jurisdiction are controlled by Democrats. Omar Fateh has consistently opposed additional funding for law enforcement, especially when it relates to immigrant enforcement. Here is Fateh leading a press conference in opposition to that funding.
This year's presidential election makes many Americans afraid of what might happen to their families and their loved ones. In these uncertain times, bold and decisive action to protect our immigrant communities is necessary. We know that citizen and non-citizen residents live side by side, often within the same household. We should not waste resources chasing them down around at the demand of Donald Trump, and no Minnesotan should have to think twice about calling 911 because their car was stolen or their child has a medical emergency.
Fateh also sponsored SF 580, which aimed to eliminate qualified immunity protections for police officers in Minnesota. Make no mistake, Fateh is anti-law enforcement and has backed every measure to hurt law enforcement while emboldening criminals. The consequences of the defund the police movement for Fateh's own community are dire. I sat down with a group of Somali community leaders at a restaurant near the Cedar Riverside neighborhood and heard a horrendous story about an underage suicide where a young Somali male jumped out of a window more than 200 feet above ground and perished upon impact. The emergency response took 3 hours. That's 3 hours of children walking by a horrific scene of undescribable carnage. 3 hours of a mother clutching the mutilated remains of her son, completely inconsolable. And these Somali leaders who I met with blamed that situation on the Democrats' efforts to defund the police and otherwise throttle the capacity of emergency services. When you talk to real people in these communities, they don't want Fateh and the Democrats and what they're selling. but they haven't been provided with a viable alternative. That needs to change. Omar Fateh supports rent control ordinances, public housing expansion, and policies framed as housing as a human right. His position applies regardless of immigration status or income verification. He continues to promote this agenda as part of his mayoral platform, even though a nearly identical policy was already passed and failed in the neighboring city of St. Paul, Minnesota. After rent control passed in St. Paul, new housing construction dropped sharply. Permits fell by over 80% within 6 months. Developers pulled projects or moved them to Minneapolis and surrounding suburbs. Property values declined. Landlords and investors devalued St. Paul properties. Some sold off rental units or converted them into owner-occupied homes. In 2022, under pressure from Mayor Melvin Carter and the city council, the policy was amended. New construction was exempted for 20 years. Just cause eviction rules were added. Yet Fateh continues to support this same approach despite its well-documented failure. Now, there's only two viable explanations for continuing to support a policy which is a proven failure. Either you're too stupid to recognize objective reality, or you don't care, because it's not actually about the success of the policy. And when we look at the pattern of fact surrounding the policies which Fateh has supported, things like housing support services, which now lay at the center of a massive new federal investigation, and things like Feeding Our Future, which provided fraudsters a smorgasbord of free taxpayer cash under the auspices of helping the needy, it would seem that the through line of these policies is that they line the pockets of corrupt individuals, many, if not all of whom, turn around and politically support Minnesota Democrats. Omar Fateh is a proud member of the Democrat Socialists of America. The DSA has already endorsed his candidacy for mayor, which he promoted on Instagram. In the last episode, I broke down the objective case for why Zohran Mamdani, the openly socialist Democrat mayoral candidate in New York City, is a genocidal racist tyrant. He refuses to condemn cries to globalize the Intifada, which means he accepts as legitimate the notion that violent uprisings against Jews should take place around the globe. And he's explicitly said verbatim that his end goal is to seize the means of production, which means seizing and enslaving people. People are the means of production. Yet the Democrat Socialists of America have endorsed him. Here's their statement. In New York City, socialism has won. Time and again, the capitalist class have told working-class New Yorkers that providing the basic necessities of affordable housing, efficient transit, and universal child care are not possible, and they should be grateful for the crumbs they do provide. But working-class New Yorkers across all different ages, races, and religions have refused to accept that lie. New York City has again proved that a better world is possible. These election results are the rejection of the Democrat Party political establishment and point to a widespread desire for an alternative to the status quo, and the need for the working class political party, DSA, is building. Zohran never ran as an individual, but as a representative of a working class socialist movement. It was this movement, spearheaded by NYC DSA, that led to this victory. The tens of thousands of people who donated, knocked on doors, made phone calls, and talked to their neighbors and coworkers not only won this election, they proved themselves more powerful than the over $25 million spent by the billionaire class to stop us. This movement is bigger than one person, election, city, or organization. We encourage all people inspired by Zohran campaign to join their local DSA or YDSA chapter and get involved so we can continue to fight alongside Zohran and DSA elected officials across the country to create the future we all deserve. So the same organization that enthusiastically supports a genocidal racist tyrant also supports Omar Fateh for mayor of Minneapolis, an endorsement that he uplifts with pride. It's astounding that anyone finds this acceptable. Right now, we're like the Weimar Republic in Germany watching the rise of the Third Reich, or Tsarist Russia during the rise of the Bolsheviks. We're watching the installation of an authoritarian regime in some of our largest and most important American cities, and we're just letting it happen. Now, we deeply value our First Amendment rights freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. But those rights don't entitle people to commit treason. They don't entitle people to conspire to deprive Americans of their civil rights, including the right to property and equal treatment under the law. And for all the flack that the Trump administration gets for its aggressive stance on immigration, there needs to be a similarly aggressive effort at rooting out this treasonous activity within American institutions. Greggy concludes his analysis of Fateh's candidacy with a very salient and necessary point. To be very clear, I do not care that Omar Fateh is Somali or Muslim. I care because he is a radical leftist pushing destructive policies. I have canvassed countless Somali households in Minnesota and helped coordinate roundtable meetings between GOP leaders and Somali business leaders across the state. I would argue that most Somalis are conservative at their core, but we have failed to earn their support. Heading into the midterms, we must do more to engage this coalition of voters who already share many of our values. We embrace conservatism regardless of a person's background. We reject communism and socialism regardless of a person's background. This matches my own experience. Again, I've sat down with Somali Americans throughout Minnesota. I've talked to their community leaders, and what I hear in those conversations is concern for public safety, educational choice, economic liberty, and the ability to live their lives according to their own values. And I also hear extraordinary frustration with the fact that anytime their community is mentioned in the media, it always seems to be connected to one of these egregious fraud schemes. The people who are doing it right, the moral actors, the folks engaging in good faith, they don't get on the news. And so the rest of Minnesota and the nation only ever associates Somalis with grift and fraud and abuse. And that lies at the feet of public figures like Omar Fateh, who perpetuate that branding in order to, 1, line the pockets of political allies, and 2, leverage the blowback against the Somali community as evidence of racism, thereby justifying further socialist policies. That cycle must be broken. And it will only be broken by a combination of conservatives reaching out to develop relationships within these communities, listen to their stories, and provide a valuable political alternative, along with members of the Somali community continuing to seek opportunities for such engagement. And the media having the courage to spotlight the many otherwise redacted stories which illuminate the truth of how this community is not just being underserved, but taken advantage of. That's it for today. For X subscribers, YouTube channel members, and audio podcast subscribers, be sure to check out my supporter-exclusive bonus show, The Smoke-Filled Room, where I get a bit more personal and cover a broader range of topics. Take care.